Hey guys, welcome back. So now we are getting into the Red Goblin conclusion, and there's a lot we gotta get to in this one, so let's just jump right in. So if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so picking up from where we left off, with Norman Osborn bonding his grandson Normie to a piece of the Carnage symbiote, it's here where we then go over to the rest of the heroes, where at this point Flash has already healed Peter's leg, but as far as everyone else who Flash did get to in time, they're still in a state of recovery with having spikes lodged into them, amongst other things, but enough has been done at this point to where they'll survive. But then just before Peter leaves, Silk then tells him that J. Jonah Jameson, he's reached out, and he's saying how that he can help, or really more so at this point that he needs to help, but Peter says no because Jameson's the reason why he's in this mess to begin with. And that just goes back to what we had talked about when Norman Osborn had kidnapped Jameson, and Jameson accidentally reminded Norman that he'd killed Gwen Stacy, which at the time is what threw all of this back into play. But then also, like when we talked about when Peter had made the deal with the Red Goblin to where Peter steps down as Spider-Man, then Norman won't go after any of Peter's family or friends. But then it was also here in issue 799 where Flash had told Peter he already found Jameson while Peter was trying to get the word out. So at that point Peter was like, okay cool, just keep an eye on him. But then when Flash had turned around, it was only to find out that Jameson had already put his Stacey Adams in sport mode and he dipped out. And when we see Jameson next, it goes into the last time we had seen him and Peter speak, really. Because for Jameson, after dipping on Flash, he had then went home and called Peter. But with Peter being pretty much Oracle at this point, like first person came to mind, I don't know. But with him being the guy in the chair and trying to facilitate as many people as he can, he just tells Jameson that Norman knows his identity again, he doesn't know how. And it's here where Jameson had told Peter that it was because of him, that he had slipped up, and everything that's happening that is his fault. And when Jameson said this, Peter had just looked at him and he hung up. Because like we talked about, man, like when Peter told Jameson his identity, it was a very vulnerable moment between the two of them. So with Peter finding this out now, I'd only imagine that he's just hurt and frustrated and pissed, like just all wrapped up into one. But then also for Jameson, with this happening, it set up the need for him to have to make this right. But then on the flip side for Peter, he feels like Jameson, he's done enough. But then in the case of Peter, after telling Silk that he doesn't want Jameson's help, he then tells Flash to stay back and take care of the others. And it's right after that when he's waved down by Harry and Liz, who let him know right away that the Goblin has taken Normie and he's bonded him with a piece of the Carnage symbiote. But with Norman and Normie nowhere in sight, Peter really just doesn't know where to start. But then it's here where Harry and Liz tell him that they know where Norman will be later on, since he's given them till sundown to hand over Alcomax. And with that alone, it gives Peter an idea of when and where he'll find the Goblin later on. But then as far as figuring out a solution on how to stop the Goblin, is here where Peter then asks Mark Raxton, who's head of security at Alcomax, if they got any more of the artificial Anti-Venom, and he's kind of like, well, we're not supposed to, but and that right there just lets Peter know like, yeah, y'all got it. But after that, Mark then gives him the heads up that they moved it to the new location, which used to be Horizon Labs. So right away Peter just rushes over there so he can get some Anti-Venom ASAP and use it against the Goblin. But then also in the case of Jameson, who's trying to find a way to help and make it right, and it's here where he comes up with the idea that you gotta fight fire with fire, and in order to stop someone with the symbiote, you gotta call somebody else with the symbiote. And with Venom being the first person who comes to mind, Jameson figures out his identity pretty quick. Because with Peter Parker being a newspaper photographer with powers, it makes him think like, man, maybe Eddie did the same thing. He then looks at it like, well, nah, it can't be that simple. Or could it? And right after that, he's just like, scammers, they're both scammers. But with figuring this out, he calls the number of Mr. Sim, which is the pseudo name that all the photography of Venom has been taken under. And when he calls his number, Jameson knows it's Eddie. Like just off of the voice alone. But when Eddie picks up, Jameson's kind of like, huh, Mr. Sim, what's your first name? B.O.? Like you gotta admit, J. Jonah got him with that one. But essentially what Jameson does is he threatens Eddie, like, look, I know your identity and you're gonna do me a favor or I'm just gonna let the cat out the bag. But he does let Eddie know that it's for a good cause, and I'm not sure if that helped, but from there Eddie let him know that they're in. But then it's here where we catch up with Peter, who's at the new Alcomax location, which used to be the Horizon Labs building. And even though it's been renovated and remodeled up top, the foundations are still the same, including the secret tunnels that Morbius used to use, so Peter uses them to make his way inside. But when he gets in, it's only to find out that the Goblin has already been there, and because of that there's no anti-venom to be found, which right away just kills Peter's plan of mixing it with his web fluid, which then kinda has him like, okay, what now? But then just after this, when he's spotted by one of Norman's symbiote pumpkin bombs, Norman then tells him that he sees Peter and that Peter broke their deal, and because of that he's going for Peter's family, starting with MJ. But in response, Peter did have a valid argument with saying that technically Norman broke the deal because he told Peter that he wasn't going to go after his family or his loved ones, which include Harry, Liz, and Normie. But the Goblin was just like, no, that's my family. You're in violation and I'm going for MJ. And so then from here heading over to MJ at Stark Tower, to where at this point she's working as Tony Stark's personal assistant during the time of Invincible Iron Man. And this arrangement was mainly offered by Tony because he had destroyed her club, the Jackpot, in Chicago. But then while MJ's here, Eddie Brock comes crashing in, and initially when this happens she doesn't know what to make of it, but at a first glance she assumes that it's Norman Osborn, so right away she triggers the alert for the fire and the Sonics. But even still with doing this, when she sees that it's Venom, she still leaves it on because he just crashed through the window unannounced, so to her it's like there's no telling what he's here for. But with Eddie in excruciating pain, he tries to tell MJ that he's here to help. But with Eddie getting hit by the fire and the Sonics, this really just leaves an opening for the Goblin to just fly right in. But with Norman getting there and Eddie fighting him off, it's pretty clear that Venom is there to help. But with the fire and the Sonics still going, which as a reminder do not harm the Goblin at this point at all. But with these defenses still going, Eddie's kind of like, look, you could turn it off now. Because really Eddie's the only one getting hurt. But then from here we then jump over to Aunt May, who at this point at her apartment she has a knock on the door and it's Normie. And when she sees him he's looking all cute and lost, so of course she lets him in, but with seeing him there she's like, I gotta call your mother Liz because she's gotta be worried. And as soon as she turns her back, Normie jumps to go after her, but then right away he's stopped by these arm tentacles that seem like they had just came out of nowhere. But of course with this happening is Otto Octavius, who at this point is the Superior Octopus. And I believe a while back we had talked about like a summary of Superior Spider-Man and also Otto becoming Superior Octopus, either around the time we were talking Spider-Geddon or Secret Empire. But even just thinking about it now, I feel like he needs some of his own videos, because at times I'll make references and then low-key do a video inside of a video, and it just has me thinking about a lot of things we should just go back and cover. But either way, when Otto shows up here, and for the record, he also was that mysterious person in the green trench coat who we had seen briefly in Amazing Spider-Man issue 799, watching the different heroes watch over Peter's loved ones, and that's how he knew to look after Aunt May. But then back over at the Stark Tower, Peter gets there and he sees Venom, and right away he's thrown off because it's kind of like, why are you here? But with Peter showing up, first thing he does is check on MJ, who at this point is equipping her repulsor glove so that she can help out with a bit of this too. But also I gotta say, like, with just talking about this, it just has me thinking of the many changes that MJ has gone through the years, whether it be actress, model, club owner, or just waking up one day and having freckles. Like, MJ is literally every woman. But then Eddie kind of breaks up this conversation because he's like, look guys, I see that y'all talking, y'all having this moment, but I'm hurting here. I barely got anything left. And when Peter jumps back in, he then starts to think of like, well, what can he do next? Or what is the plan that's gonna actually stop the Goblin? And as Peter's thinking, like, every living, breathing thing has a weakness, he's then like, that's it, breathing. And with thinking that, he goes from punching the Goblin in the face to punching him in the neck, which by the way hurts for anyone who's fortunate enough not to know. But this then doesn't work for Peter for too long, because Goblin just catches that arm and just bites him, which then causes MJ to panic and hit the Goblin with a repulsor blast. But this then ended up hurting Peter and Eddie more than it did Norman. But then also with this happening, it gave the Goblin a clean shot to go for MJ, and with doing so he then hits her with like the symbiote spike attack, much like he did with everyone else. And from here he then leaves to go after his grandson Normie, who at this point has deemed himself the Goblin child. That kid's scarred for life. But with leaving, Norman tells Peter that he left Normie to go after Aunt May, to where at this point she's probably dead by now. So he's like, he's gonna pick up his grandkid, and after that he's coming back for MJ. But when the Goblin leaves, Eddie's like, look man, like, you need to take my symbiote. And of course initially Peter's just like, no, or better yet, no way in hell. But then when MJ tells him that it's probably a good idea, with Aunt May being in danger and there's really no time to really try to cook up or prepare a better plan. But with this happening, Peter redons the symbiote, and as he heads to Aunt May's apartment, he once again feels that faster, better, stronger feeling. But then also with him redonning the symbiote this time, it looks different, and much that has to do with it having been with Flash and also Eddie, and the symbiote learning to be good after it was discarded by Peter. But then it's also here while Peter's heading over to Aunt May's apartment, where we see Flash, who's rushed everyone to the hospital because the Anti-Venom alone is not working. And it's like, sure, he's able to keep these guys alive, but even still something's not quite right. But then while Peter's en route to Aunt May's apartment, he gets a call from J. Jonah Jameson, and it's here where Jameson lets him know like he's trying to help and that he already had sent someone to help MJ, which is how Peter finds out about who called Eddie. But then Peter just hangs up on Jameson again, telling him like, dude, you've done enough, stop helping. But then over at Aunt May's apartment with Otto and Normie just tearing the place apart, Aunt May then steps in and breaks a chair over Normie's head, which for her it's a little funny because when Otto had first got there, she was like, Otto, oh my god, what are you doing? He's just a kid. And then when the kid turned into Goblin Child, that's when Aunt May then chimed in with the chair upside the kid's head. But then it's funny because we get this moment where she's like, I baked cookies for you. Like, how could you do this, Normie? And in response, Normie is then like, you put raisins in them. You deserve to die. And when he said that back at the time, I was just like, damn Sly, you a wild boy. But then it's here where J. Jonah then steps in with the Spider Slayer, which is also something we've seen return more recently within Spider-Man Spider Shadow, although with that being a different universe altogether. But then much like I mentioned in that video, Jameson's not a stranger to this thing. But when Jameson steps in, he attacks Normie and Otto. And with doing so, assuming that Otto was working with the Goblin, but also with making that mistake, he also sets himself up to be alone versus the Goblin when he shows up, which ultimately leaves him and Otto defeated and Aunt May there just by herself, and the Goblin ready to leave a deadly message for Peter Parker. And shortly after, when Peter finally gets there, he approaches Aunt May's apartment only to see the Goblin leaving at this point. So already he's like, oh no, I'm too late. And when he gets inside and he sees the Spider Slayer, which is completely just wrecked, with Jameson on the screen saying he tried to help, he tried his best, but then Peter just crushes the screen because he's not trying to hear it. But then as a result, with Jameson, who is just desperate to make things right, he then just grabs his gun and he walks out the door. But with Peter getting to Aunt May's apartment, what he finds here is that Otto leaped in the way, saving Aunt May at the last second, which at this point with Otto, it still has a lot to do with him still having Peter's memories, which started in Superior Spider-Man, but is still very much the case here with his new body of the Proto-Clone, which is a hybrid of both Otto and Peter. But even before any of that, Otto by himself, he had always had a level of care and respect for Aunt May, even though through the years him and Peter have had their differences. But then with Peter leaving here to go after the Goblin, Aunt May tells him to look after that kid Normie, because when it's all said and done, he's just a kid, and he really doesn't know what he's doing. But then it's after this when we then get to Alcomax, where at this point Norman and Normie, they're making their way in at sundown in order to finalize the agreement, or demand more or less, for Liz to hand over her company. But then when Norman gets here, he only sees Liz and Mark Raxton, which initially has him thinking like, okay, well maybe Harry just didn't have the stomach to show up. But then with Liz showing Norman the huge stack of paperwork, she lets him know that there's no way she could just hand him the company in a matter of days, weeks, or even months. And she tells him like, what do you think this is, Parker Industries? And I'm sure if Otto was here, he would feel highly disrespected at that statement. But then it's here where Norman shows the face of Mason Banks, who like we talked about before is like the identity he had posed as when he first came back and he was working for Alcomax. And with doing this, he tells Liz that he knows the ins and outs of this company. And as it turns out, they have a beneficiary clause and an all or nothing trust, so that if anything happens, the company and the funds go down to Normie, with the inclusion of his surviving legal guardian. And with saying this, Norman is pretty much like, well look, this is anything is happening. And right away, Liz tries to reason with Normie and let him know like, this is what your grandfather's been planning. He wants to kill your parents and build this twisted legacy. But then also with doing this, she clicks a button and she calls in Harry. And right away he comes in with an old Goblin glider and a bunch of Humanitrons from Humanitech, and he just swoops in and he grabs Normie. But even with this happening, Normie still feels a bit of resentment for his father from the time that Harry had disappeared after becoming the Goblin and after he died, which had just played into a number of events that led Normie to believe that his father didn't want him. And with Harry having another son, Stanley, later on with a different mother, Normie had then felt like that was the son that Harry loved. And back at this time, we had still saw Normie dealing with that. But regardless of his past and his decisions, Harry has always loved Normie. And when he tells Normie here that he's not letting go, he's not giving up on his family, Normie notices that. He notices his dad Harry fighting for his family. But while this is happening, it's here when Norman then grabs Liz and throws her through the window, while saying, what is it with me and blondes in high places? And man, I gotta tell you, like, Norman Osborn is the worst, man. And when he throws Liz through the window, like, it's here where Normie gets to see that, like, firsthand, by witnessing with his grandfather that there's really no limit with this guy. And Norman's response after doing this, it's pretty much just boo hoo hoo, grow up, kid. But then when Peter swings in after catching Liz, it's like it's here where the heroic music just comes in. Like, cue my favorite Spider-Man song from Nickelback. But then it's here for Normie where he then realizes, like, dang, granddaddy, you ain't shit. Like, you legit try to kill Mom. And with seeing this, Normie tries to go after him, which of course he's not going to overpower him. But fortunately, Peter's able to stop Norman and save his godson. But then right after, Harry then races for Norman with the glider, and right away Peter holds Norman like, oh yeah baby, here we go. And Harry just jumps off the glider, allowing it to impale Norman again. And really, this has me thinking, like, when Norman Osborn came back and he had implemented the whole thing with the Goblin protocols, like, he should have hunted down every glider on the face of the earth and just made sure that the Goblin protocols was loaded on them before doing anything else. But with this happening, it creates this real emotional moment between Harry, Normie, and Liz, with them fighting to stay together, and that Harry meant what he said when he told Normie that he was never gonna let him go. And with this taking place, like, Norman, he's effectively lost his grandson, in spite of Normie still having a piece of the Carnage symbiote. But as far as his plans that we'd seen with him building this legacy for Normie and doing it the Goblin way, like, that's practically done, because at this point his whole family's turned against him. But then after this, when he then goes after Peter then begins to lead Norman away, and it's here where right away Norman notices that Peter's doing the whole lead away thing, like, we've done this dance before. But then when Peter taunts Norman, telling him that he's ineffective and that he said he was gonna kill his family and loved ones, but that hasn't happened. And it's here where Norman's like, oh, hasn't it? And it's here where he then drops his backup plan on Peter, which then goes back to every symbiote shard that he has shot into everyone prior to this point, which he still has control of. And he lets Peter know, like, in the snap of a finger, he can make all these shards shoot up into their brains, killing everyone at one time, but then also causing them to suffer with the most excruciating pain. And when he tells this to Peter, he then snaps his finger, but nothing happens. And he knows this because he would also, through this connection, feel their suffering and feel their agony. But when nothing happens, he immediately thinks that Peter had did something with the little spider bugs. And Norman's like, was it the bugs? But then when Flash shows up with the number of the shards, it's just kind of like, boom, you looking for this? And it's here where Flash lets him know that from when he noticed Clash having a bad reaction to the Goblin's attack, he had then went to everyone else who was affected, and he had used what anti-venom he could in order to ease their pain and remove these shards. Which right away just has Peter like, alright, Corporal Eugene Thompson for the win. But then this whole moment is cut short when the Goblin sends his glider to bite Peter on the arm and fly away with him. And with the Goblin doing this and diving in after Flash, Flash immediately hits him with the anti-venom attack, which at this point is effectively killing the Carnage symbiote. But with Peter being pulled away, he tells Flash to hang in there, he'll get back to him as soon as he can. But even with Flash weakening the Carnage symbiote, he's still dealing with Norman Osborn with the Goblin serum. And because of that, with it being this weakened Flash against Norman Osborn with the serum, Norman's then able to bring Flash within inches of his life. And when Peter sees this, he loses it, and he practically turns into Venom, and he just destroys the symbiote infused glider. And so now with seeing this, I do want to say, like, we've talked about dark versions of Peter Parker, either with or without the symbiote. And I've noticed that a number of times there's kind of been this debate in the comments on whether any of those were Peter Parker becoming Venom, and none of the ones that we covered are. But this right here, this is one of those times. And with Peter becoming Venom here, he literally punches the Red Goblin into another zip code. And I'm talking about like on some Superman, punched through the buildings. Like the power he shows just initially, like, it's nuts. But even when this happens, it's not something that we get for long, because Flash, he then begs Peter to calm down because the Venom symbiote, it's good now. And Flash knows because he was a part of making that happen. And he tells Peter, like, don't let your rage infect the symbiote and be the reason that it turns bad again. And this is what then causes Peter to will it back in and tend to Flash. And he even makes a suggestion on giving Flash the Venom symbiote in order to help him. But Flash tells him no, because that could also kill the Venom symbiote, to where then Peter wouldn't really have a chance to go after Norman. And right now, Peter needs every advantage that he can get. But then Flash also tells Peter that the people need him, because the Goblin, he's now been knocked into Times Square, and Flash tells him that the people need Peter Parker, the Amazing Spider-Man, his hero, his friend. And with saying these last words, Flash dies in Peter's arms. But then over in Times Square, because the Goblin, he's been like en route this whole time. But with the Goblin, when he lands in Times Square, initially people think like he's part of some movie set, because really this whole thing of him being the Red Goblin is still fairly new. But then also he's mistaken for someone who's just dressing up to do gigs, and then this guy who's dressed up like Spider-Man, he tells the Goblin to get out of there, with this particular area being his corner. I don't know specifically what he means by that, but I do know that the Goblin doesn't want him here either, like in the land of the living, with him seeing this guy in a Spider-Man costume and then going for the instant kill. But then it's here where Peter shows up and he's highly upset about the death of Flash, and then the Goblin just killing this random person for no reason. And it's here where Norman more or less has like an aha moment, and he tells Peter that he now realizes that he never really had to throw Gwen Stacy off of a bridge. And I wish he would have just took a second and just told us, like, was it the George Washington Bridge or the Brooklyn Bridge? Like, I'm asking for a friend, because that question's been going back and forth for years now. But it's here where he tells Peter that he now realizes that he didn't have to kill Gwen Stacy, because Peter cares about everyone. And with realizing this, he then goes full griefer mode, like down at Times Square, and he just lets out symbiote pumpkin bombs on everybody in every direction, which at that point then causes Peter to go in every kind of which way to try to save as many people as he can. But then also with doing this, there's wreckage, there's explosions, there's chaos, which then brings him to the point of losing the Goblin, to whom, with the symbiote, he's then able to get the drop on Peter without triggering his spider sense. And when this happens, like in this moment, it's almost like this is it. The heat from all the wreckage is crazy, so Peter's symbiote can barely take it, and the Goblin has now got the choke on Peter, so Peter's now scrambling like, what am I gonna do? But then when the Goblin says like this is finally it, this is his moment of triumph, this is Norman Osborn victorious. But this is also what causes Peter to realize the Goblin's weakness, which for Norman is his pride. And it's here where Peter tells him like, no, this isn't it, because if you kill me now, the credit's gonna go to the Carnage symbiote, which from there is just gonna go back to Cletus Cassidy. And when Peter says this, it messes Norman up, because you then see Cletus Cassidy in his eyes. And it's here where Peter tells Norman that you gotta face me one-on-one without the symbiote. You let go of yours, I let go of mine, because if we do this any other way, there's pretty much gonna be like an asterisk over your win. And when this happens, Peter lets go of the Venom symbiote and he tells him to get out of here, get away from this heat. And when the Venom symbiote leaves, like it's so adorable here, like like you can tell in its expression that it misses Peter. But with Peter letting the Venom symbiote go, now it's just him standing here, ready to face off against the Green Goblin, not the Red Goblin. Which in this case, with Peter going first, like it's really bold, and it kind of sends a statement like, Norman, you're not gonna win. But then for Norman, because of his pride, he then strips off the Carnage symbiote, and he also lets it go, telling it that he doesn't need it, because now he's ready to prove, and like truly prove, that he can beat Spider-Man solely as the Green Goblin with nothing else. And when they go at it, like Peter, he's laying into this guy. And of course with using his restraint, because he still doesn't want to kill him, so Peter's practically using his fighting style like the way of the PG-13. But while they're fighting, fire then catches on this gas tank on a car nearby, triggering Peter's spider sense, then blowing up and more or less turning the tide of the fight. And it's really messed up, because prior to this, Peter was winning and he was laying into the Goblin because he knew after all of this, like this was his chance. And with the Goblin getting the upper hand, he totally takes advantage of it. And when he does, he then starts to brag, telling Peter that all his friends are down or dead and it's because of him. But then also because of that, he tells Peter that no one's coming to save him. And it's right then when Peter gets the upper hand, and he tells the Goblin that his friends and his family, they're always with him in everything that he does. Like with his Uncle Ben, a man without powers who had taught him about courage, as well as Gwen Stacy's father who had taught Peter about sacrifice. And it's here where Peter lets him know like everyone in his life has given him a reason for him to never stop fighting. And really, it's moments like these right here where when people ask like, why is Spider-Man so big? Or how did he make it into like your top 5 biggest superheroes of all time? To where really the argument floats around Spider-Man, Superman, and Batman. But when people ask this question, you just gotta let them know. Spider-Man's struggles, his grit, his tenacity, like it just hits different. But Peter even goes on to tell Norman that his friends even give him something to live up to where this time he's referencing the late Flash Thompson. But then with Norman getting the mess beat out of him, he then calls for the Carnage symbiote to come back. And right away, Peter's like, nah, we ain't doing that again. And it's here when Peter takes the opportunity while the two of them are still separate, and with them being separate, they still have their weaknesses, so he reaches for a remaining piece of that burning gas tank, and he smashes it just right on top of the symbiote in order to cause another explosion, which just blows him and send Norman into the sky. But then it's here to where after things have settled to where Jameson arrives and he makes it clear he came here to shoot Norman Osborn and end this for good. And he tells Peter like if he doesn't do this, Norman is just gonna come back and more people are gonna get killed, and next time it could be Betty, Robbie, Aunt May, his son, or even him. And with saying this, he then squeezes the trigger, but then only for Peter to jump in front of the bullet and take the shot that was supposed to kill Norman Osborn. And when this happens and Jameson asks Peter like why would you do that? And it's here where he tells Jameson that he had to because he could. Because with great power comes great responsibility, and that goes for everyone, even the worst of us. And from there, Jameson just drops the gun and he takes off. But then it's from here where Norman Osborn is then taken to Ravencroft, to where at this point we find out that his mind is pretty much fried. Because when Peter gets a moment alone with them to more or less see if Norman has told anyone his secret, and it's here where Norman Osborn tells Peter, I know your secret, you're Norman Osborn. And when he says that, Peter's kind of like, okay, well then who are you? And in response, Norman tells him that he is Cletus Cassidy. And it's then when Peter just turns around like, okay, we're good here. Because he knows his secret is safe. Because no one's going to believe this guy, even if he actually did remember. But then also, I'd say if you want to follow up with Norman Osborn from here, his story picks up in Absolute Carnage, and I got that link below. But then also, just to wrap this up, there are a few other things that kind of take place here. Because it's here where we then go to Alcomax Red Labs in upstate New York, to where Liz and Harry have taken Normie to Dr. Steven, to where they then put him through a process in order to get the symbiote that he was bonded with extracted. And even though Harry was like, once you get that thing out, destroy it, but then Liz was like, no, let's keep it in case Normie has complications. And when the process is done, she tells Mark to lock the symbiote up somewhere safe and private. But even still, there's kind of like this eerie vibe of what y'all really want to do with that thing. But then on top of that, we also get this eerie reminder that the whole situation with Normie and the symbiote, it's not over, which is something we also see come back up later on in Absolute Carnage. But then it's also here where we get the funeral of Corporal Flash Thompson, which is done really well in my opinion for a number of reasons, whether it being from Betty's speech to Peter's speech, and just with the way how Peter talks about when Flash was a bully, but bullies don't come out of nowhere, and how Peter didn't find out about why Flash had became a bully until later in life. But then for Peter, he goes a bit deeper and he talks around the details here. But when he then gets into how Flash was inspired to join the military, which for Flash was because of Spider-Man, who had inspired Flash to save and help people. But then on the flip side, with Peter seeing Flash going forward and fighting for his country, this had then helped Peter at a moment in his life where he had become the bully. And it just really shows how the two of them had just made such a huge impact on each other's lives. And in many ways, neither of them knowing until later. But then also I like that we get this moment between Peter and Jameson to where they're at least able to smooth things out, because when Aunt May tells Peter to go over and talk to Jameson, with them practically being like family because of her history with Jameson's father, and in this moment J. Jonah, he just doesn't need to be shut out. And so when Peter and him get to talk and Peter tells him like, look, no hard feelings, and it helps because Jameson just goes back to being the nice Jameson, or his version of that. Because when they then hear sirens going off and he tells Peter he needs to go, or tells Peter that he's needed, and it's like right away you can tell they're back on good terms. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the patrons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below so we can go to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. And I do also want to say that there's another Red Goblin, Red Death story that it came out like in 2019, and it tried to go back and tell the story of like when Norman Osborn had initially bonded with the Carnage symbiote, but I definitely had left that out for this one, and I'm pretty sure no one would be disappointed about that. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.